Welcome. My name is Shannon White and I'm the pastor at Wilton Presbyterian Church. We've been given a grant from the Mental Health Ministries unit of the Presbyterian Church to do some mental health ministry. And as part of that, we are able to conduct a couple of interviews to deal with issues of mental health. And today, I'm delighted to welcome Lindsay Wheeler. Lindsay grew up in Wilton Presbyterian Church. She is a 2010 graduate of Wilton High School. She earned a BA in psychology from Middlebury College and a master's in clinical social work from Columbia University just in 2020. Specializing in childhood trauma, crisis intervention, and advocating for mental illness and racialized and LGBTQIA communities. She is also a reflective writer and the founder of, for those in Wilton, College Creamery. I didn't know that. So welcome, Lindsay. I'm so glad that you are here. So tell us a bit of your story.
So it starts when I was probably 2 or 3 years old. I, on the outside, appeared to be a normal, happy kid, but there was always sort of an unsettledness. I can't exactly explain what that was like, and I definitely didn't know that it was different than what other kids were experiencing, but there was always sort of some dread that I now see as being related to depression. And as I aged, it sort of grew, I would say. I think back and I'm not able to really tell the story of my childhood in the way that many kids are, because I think I sort of was focusing so much on getting through each day that I really wasn't living in the moment and remembering that. So it was really middle school, I would say, where it started to get more extreme. I was really trying to avoid going to school. I had severe anxiety about being in any space that wasn't my room, but I was pushing myself to do it, and I was getting there, and I was getting to sports, and I was social, I had friends, so it seemed like everything was okay on the outside. High school was where it really had come to a point where I just really didn't know how to manage it. I was missing school probably 3 days a week. My mom and dad were trying to drag me out of bed and didn't understand what was going on. It seemed like it was normal high schooler behavior, I guess, to them. But inside, I was in complete hysteria. I was so wounded in a way that I could not exactly attribute to anything. I felt very different than everyone, even though on the outside I looked like everyone else. I was performing well in sports, but my grades started to slip. I would get in my car and I would just drive to a parking lot and just sob for hours by myself, and I didn't want anyone to know this. So I just would laugh when I went into a social space or at home, and I seemed like I was doing fine. So there were things that I think were kind of noticeable, the school, not going to school, things like that, but otherwise I seemed like I was just a teenager. And then college, I came to see that I actually couldn't deal with the feelings the way that I had been, because it was seeping into other areas of my life finally. So for example, I started to lose a lot of weight. Like I probably lost 30 or 40 pounds. And again, in a society that really values that and ties self-worth to your weight, I was just being praised left and right for looking great, and a lot of people didn't see that as being tied to something deeper. So I finally went to a doctor about my eating, because I really wasn't able to eat, and if I did, I would have like a panic attack. And this doctor set up a whole team for me, and including a therapist, and I started to really realize that there were some deeper issues that I needed to address, which is kind of amazing because there were so many signs all along, but I really wasn't able to recognize it as being a mental illness. That was just not something that was even in my vocabulary at the time. And so I finally started to do a little bit of work on myself, and it took time. It took a long time to be able to talk about what was going on and put the words to it. But then years later, I finally spoke out about what it really was after I had a diagnosis.
And what is that?
So initially I was diagnosed with depression, just the sort of depression we hear about all the time now. And then I was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which definitely fits me more. And it shows in part why I was able to function at such a high level for somebody who had depression, because I would come out of my depression and I would be like energized, which in some ways just looked normal, but was definitely edging on mania, which is just basically where your thoughts are racing and maybe it will present as being really excited about something, but it's actually a deeper issue. And so that really characterized a lot of my issues better than depression did.
There were other nuanced pieces to your story. So you were dealing with some questions about your sexual identity. Can you talk about that some?
So when I was in high school, I definitely knew that something about me was different, but I couldn't place what that was. And I must have been repressing it to such an extent that I couldn't tell you that it was that I was gay. But later, as time went on, I started to really face it and realized that for a very long time, I lived with so much shame about who I was that I almost just couldn't, I just had to kind of compartmentalize it. And then later I realized, oh, okay, so you're gay and you have an immense amount of shame that you now need to work through. I think growing up where I grew up in Wilton, Connecticut, there was a mold that everyone felt they had to fit. And so I worked so hard to fit that mold that I truly couldn't even face the sides of me that were kind of tormenting me in the background. But when I did face that and I did realize that I was gay, it kind of was like a breathing tube for me. I suddenly could breathe. I suddenly could love parts of myself that I previously hadn't, and I was able to be proud. But it definitely took a long time to get there.
So obviously you have a loving community around you. You have family that loves you. You grew up in this church. What are some things now that you've been trained and now that you've done a lot of your own work, what are some things that you think would have been helpful to have heard or to have experienced from those around you that could have helped you more?
I think that's probably the best question that you can ask. Anybody should be asking that, I think, because it doesn't take a lot to make people who feel very different feel accepted. So anything that really makes somebody feel like their identity is affirmed, whether it's having depression or having bipolar disorder or any other sort of mental illness, or being somebody who identifies as LGBTQ+, having that affirmed, whether it's putting a rainbow flag out on the lawn in front of a church or in front of a home, whether it's just having conversations, normalizing these conversations in my case, to have made me feel normal, that would have gone a huge distance for me.
And in terms of the mental health issues, your impending diagnosis that you were kind of growing into, what are some signs that people around you either saw and kind of registered or didn't see that you now, having been trained, could go back and say, okay, so this is what was going on?
Mm-hmm. A lot of the signs that I showed and that I think would be good to look out for in kids around you would be things like weight loss or weight gain, big fluctuations in weight, sleeping issues, just persistent sadness that lasts for weeks and weeks or months, versus everybody has ups and downs, of course. All sorts of sort of like irritabilities about things that maybe seem just outsized, I would say, or things that seem minor and you have an outsized reaction to. Like I would get very, very worked up very quickly. I could be fine and going about my day, and then a small thing would happen and I would be completely devastated and unable to regulate my emotions. And then of course, if you're hearing a child talk about harming themselves or killing themselves or death a lot, that's the sort of thing that's jarring, but also needs to be addressed, because a lot of times parents and friends of somebody who's presenting in that way want to avoid it and are afraid if we talk about it, maybe they'll kill themselves, something like that. But you can directly ask someone about whether they're having these thoughts. It has been shown to not be connected to hurting yourself or killing yourself. It's actually something that you can talk about and discover more, and that's like probably the most important thing you can do.
If someone were watching this and were listening to your story and identified something in their child or perhaps something in themselves with your story, what word would you have for them? What do they need to be watching out for?
There were definitely many times where I didn't want to be here and I didn't think that I would make it to the next day. And so hopefully you're able to see that even if your child is visibly struggling or hiding it, but you think there might be something wrong, they can be okay with the right support. Providing them the love and assurance that it's okay if they're not okay is really, really important, and that should hopefully make you feel like you have something that you can actually do. If you would bring them to a doctor or a therapist and be a part of their journey, that goes a long way. But there are so many ways that you can find hope right now. There are a lot of resources and a lot of people who care and a lot of people who are working to normalize these conversations. Many of us share these sorts of experiences. I would say more people than not share some sort of experience with me and with what I'm talking about, whether it's a loved one or themselves. And so it's okay to just let your guard down and talk about these things. I started talking about all of this in 2014, and I was scared, and I started by just saying, I'm depressed, very tiny little voice. And now, if you know me, you know that I am shouting it from the rooftop everywhere I go because it's the way that I connect to people, and it's not sad. It seems like a sad subject, but it's not. It gives me a lot of joy to be able to connect with people in this way, and I've made it my life's work. I have conversations with people in the grocery store. My mom's friends come to me for support and questions, and if you normalize it and talk about it and destigmatize it, it can be a really beautiful thing.
So thinking back, is there any way that the church could have been more helpful and impactful in your journey?
Well, when I was growing up and coming to the church, I think at that time, very few places were doing things to affirm different identities. So I definitely don't hold it against the church, but it would have been amazing to have known that conversations like this were happening, whether it was on a small scale or larger scale on Sundays in church. Things like putting a flag outside, putting a sign up that says all are welcome. Things that are obviously bigger statements are wonderful, but even the smallest things, telling stories about couples that are same gender, things like that goes a huge way.
This is a high-pressured town, a town that where the exterior of someone is really important, as you said. What could you say to people in the town, whether it's parents who are looking or the school system or anybody, about the effects of that pressure on kids?
Yeah, so the pressure is part of why I struggled so much as a child. I felt I had pressure coming from every angle to be a certain person, and I knew internally that I wasn't that person. And that's really hard. It's a really, really hard hurdle. But I would say the world is changing, even if it doesn't feel like it in this small bubble. There are a lot of ways that you can find support, find help, find advocacy opportunities, use your voice. If we can start a little bit of a movement in a town that is really full of a lot of pressure, we can really make change. So whether it's reaching out to a friend that you think would be a good person to kind of team up with you, that could be a great way. Start a little task force or something at your kid's school or among the parents of kids that you know. Have it be a real conversation. Incorporate it into the spaces that you feel have a lot of pressure. Because pressure it's hard, it sits on you, it's weight, but it's not something that we can't combat by just kind of pushing through it. And that's what I did. And I'm on the other side, and I know there's still pressure here, but I feel really, really good about what I'm doing and who I am.